Alright everyone, so just want to take you through a lap with the hypercar and note some things that's going to become important with traffic management, especially if you're driving a hypercar. So first of all, this is going to turn 1 of Qatar, and for the hypercar drivers we are braking at the 100 meter board. I was braking a little bit earlier than the 100 meter board here, but I did find later on when I had a bit more confidence I could brake a bit later. Anyway, so while we are braking at or just before the 100 meter board in the GT car, you are braking just before the 50 meter board. GT cars are probably going to be braking around here, whereas as hypercar drivers are braking around here or here. So whilst we are braking a lot earlier than the GT3 cars because we're coming at turn 1 at such a much higher speed, we are actually going to be able to effectively outbrake the GT cars. Let's pretend this is our speed trace. The GT car coming in something like this. Whereas for the hypercar, they're coming in something like that. So whilst we are braking earlier, we are coming at such a much higher speed and we are able to carry more speed through the corner that we're basically constantly gaining time and distance on the GT3 drivers. And then as you can see there, the GT car is starting to lose more speed in order to keep the car on the apex, whereas the hypercar, you are starting to lose less speed until you get basically to your point where you go on the throttle, the speed begins to pick up again. So, as a hypercar, you can outbrake a GT car into this corner, but there is one interesting thing to note with the GT cars is that a lot of them are choosing to brake in this manner. So they're not braking in a straight line along this curve and then turning in for the apex. They are turning in for the apex, then braking. So they're moving diagonally across the track. So hypercar drivers, watch out for this behavior. Make sure you don't get caught out by it. Now, one thing, but the biggest difference between hypercars and GT3 cars is in mile speed. The hypercars are able to carry through the corners relative to the GT cars. So if you're up against a really good GT driver, you might notice you're not necessarily able to outbrake the GT driver, but you're able to carry a lot more speed through the corner. So in some cases, you aren't close enough to the GT to be alongside into the braking zone. So you want to stay behind. You don't want to suddenly dive up the inside like an idiot. You want to stay behind, but you are going to be able to carry a lot more speed through the corner. So if, let's say, GT driver is just staying on this inside curbing, as the normal racing line will be, as a hypercar driver, if you're really close to him, not close enough to overtake him under braking, but close enough to be alongside throughout this corner, one of the things you can do is carry more speed on a wider line. So that's the one option. Other option is as you're going through turn 1, the GT drivers on the exit of this corner begin on the power and immediately drifting wide, all the way out to that outside curbing. They can't easily determine how wide they go. Like once they get on the throttle here, they are set on this racing line. They can't just suddenly get a tight exit. So if you're still behind the GT driver at this stage, you can still go wide, but instead of trying to go wide to overtake around the outside, you go wide to perform a switchback. With the hypercar, since you've got aerodynamics, you can still get on the throttle earlier than the GT driver and take a tighter line. You have a lot more control over what your car does at a higher speed. So that's turn 1. For turn 2, it's a medium speed corner. So I would say that GT cars and hypercars will be carrying similar speeds through here. But again, GT car, if you go wide, you lose a lot of time. So you can't expect the GT drivers to take a wide line through here. So if I'm a hypercar driver and I'm right behind a GT car here going to this braking zone, even though the inside looks very inviting, I'm not going to go and try and outbrake the GT car on the inside. And again, this is one of those corners where the GT drivers are pointing their nose towards the apex before they brake. They aren't taking this type of line. Some of them are, but most of them, I've noticed, have been turning in a little bit earlier. Now, the hypercar can run this line a lot more easily and then bring it in for an apex. So again, if you're right behind a GT driver into turn 2, rather try avoid diving up the inside and trying to outbrake the GT driver. Rather brake a little bit earlier and a little bit softer around the outside. Carry the speed through here. And then you can either try and overtake around the outside, or again, you can stay here wide and then come in for a switchback while the GT driver is drifting out wide. And then again, the hypercar got a lot more horsepower, you've also got more downforce, so you're going to be able to be much faster than any GT driver on the exits of the corners, more so than on the entries. Then this turn here, it's flat out for both hypercars and GT drivers, or GT cars. So if you're a GT driver and you've got a hypercar overtaking on the outside, just make sure you apply a little more steering lock and use as much of this inside curve as possible, because you're going to have to leave a car's width over here, basically. So you want to be able to take a slightly tighter line and have a tighter exit. As a GT driver, you don't want to drift wide onto the racing line if you've got a hypercar overtaking around the outside, because then there'd be contact and very likely you're the one who's going to be spun around. Same thing for the hypercar drivers. If you are overtaking around the outside of a GT driver here, you have to make sure you leave a car's width on the inside curb here, or the inside part of the track here. Now going through into the next turn, I believe this is turn 4. Now this is a fairly short corner. So as we go through this corner, the GT drivers will be utilizing this curb, turning in early, and trying to use as much of the inside curve as possible. But there's a catch here. As a hypercar driver, you can't expect the GT driver to be on one side of the track all the time. So if you're coming in right behind a GT driver, what you want to do is brake earlier for this corner and turn in later. Keep on going straight, then turn in. Hit the apex a little bit later with your nose already pointing to the middle of the track. Instead of to the outside curbing, you're going to wash out just to the middle of the track. So you want to do this. Now, if you're right behind a GT driver, you will be able to carry a lot more speed through this corner, so you're going to have to wait a lot. So make sure you overslow your car, you wait and you wait and you wait until you see that, okay, we're about to hit an apex here. Now you can go on the throttle on the inside and slot in right behind, well, right on the inside of the GT driver as you wash it out wide. And again, if you're a GT driver and you've got a hypercar right behind you, don't take a tight exit, because that is only going to cause confusion and very likely cause a collision. So if you've got a hypercar behind you through this corner and he's not alongside you yet, take your normal line on the exit, because that's basically the only thing that the hypercar driver will be expecting you to be doing. If you suddenly take a tight exit, he's probably set himself up for a switchback, and now suddenly in his way he's going to have to go to the outside, but now his momentum is balked, so he can't actually get past you quickly. So that's the one thing here, is that you perform a switchback through the first apex. But the other thing is, let's say you've done this first turn, and now you come up against a GT driver who's taking his normal racing line through here. What can you do at this point? Dive up the inside? No. Do not dive up the inside. That's the worst thing you can do. Because this is barely, in fact, in the GT cars, you're not even touching the brakes much at all. You're doing like 2% brake pressure through here. This is not a braking zone. So for you to now suddenly, as a hypercar driver, try and carry more speed on the inside, you just got to make contact. There's no two ways about that. And again, as a GT driver, very difficult for them to turn in later and still make the corner. They have to turn in at their correct reference. If they try and turn in later, they're going to have to lose a lot more speed and stuff. So they're not going to be as willing to take a wider turn in. So what you do as a hypercar driver is you're coming up here right behind them. You carry on a little bit straight for longer. Go on straighter for longer. Turn in, take a later apex, and then exit nice and tight, leaving a car's width on the outside, performing a switchback. Because again, at this point, you as a hypercar driver, you're just carrying so much more speed through this section that you're going to have to take a different line when you come up against GT traffic. Otherwise, if you've got, let's say, two GT cars batting side by side through this section, you're just going to have to sit back and wait. Sit there, wait, then get on the power here and hope that they move to the outside. Or if, let's say, both GT cars in the middle of the second apex have gone wide into the gravel, well, if you've been waiting, you can now take a nice tight line on the exit and then utilize your power to get on through. Okay, so now we are going into the turn 6 hairpin. Very important thing to note, you are not going to be able to outbrake a GT driver into this hairpin if you are driving a hypercar. Hypercars have to brake before this board. GT drivers are braking well after this board. And the top speeds between the hypercars and the GT3 cars aren't a whole lot different in this section. So if you are right behind a GT driver going into this braking zone, so let's say at this point where I'm a hypercar here, let's say I've got a GT car literally that close in front of me. Don't go full dive up the inside. Stay behind them, brake a little bit early if you have to. Now remember that you'll be carrying a similar speed through the apex of the corner as the GT3 car. And also, another thing to note, if you brake early in the hypercar, don't necessarily brake too softly. You still want to brake with the correct technique and everything, because if you brake too softly initially, well, you're just not going to bleed off the speed quickly enough, and you're going to end up locking up your tires, trying to avoid crashing into the GT3 car. So you want to stay behind a GT car through here. You're not going to lose any time. GT cars will be quicker than you anyway. What you want to do again here is focus on the exits. So if you have to take a wider entry and a wider line mid-corner so that you can set up a better and tighter exit compared to a GT car that is hiking this curbing and then going out wide, feel free to do that. That's probably the best use of your time whilst you are behind the GT driver. But otherwise, main thing here, be patient and don't fret. You won't lose a lot of time behind a GT driver through here. One more thing to note about this section is the GT3 cars will be migrating from the right-hand side of the track to the left-hand side of the track on this short straight. So if you have the hypercar driver, initially you'll have to overtake them on the left-hand side of the track, but then later on down the straight, you can expect the GT driver to be occupying the left-hand side, so you have to overtake on the right-hand side into the next corner. Okay, so continuing on from here, we are going into is turn 7. This is the final turn on the second sector. So here is one of the few corners where hypercars and GT3 cars are braking at similar points. Now, for hypercars, you're braking after this Bosch sign or this white line. Same thing for GT3 cars, but as it is for turn 1, GT3 cars are preferring to turn in, then brake. So again, they turn in, point their nose to the apex, then brake hard. Whereas for the hypercars, we are able to run a much more traditional straight line braking, then we ease the car in as we trail off the brakes. So for GT3 cars, if they carry too much speed into this corner, they just understeer, lose a lot of time. So therefore, most of the time, you'll find GT3 cars will be tight to the apex here and hugging this curve. Now, hypercars, however, can run an outside line and not lose too much time. In fact, they can get really good exits running that line. So for multi-class traffic here, I would not recommend trying to outbrake a GT car on the inside because you're not braking later than them normally anyway. And if you do that, you're going to go on a wider line, and the GT driver is not willing to take a wider line. So if you're behind a GT3 car into this corner, so let's say at this point, right before the braking zone, you have got, again, GT3 driver right in front of you. Don't succumb to the urge to go up the inside. That's just not going to work. So what you want to do is, in this instance, be patient, brake a little bit earlier, slow down a little bit more, wait for the GT car to go to the inside. Once he's on the inside, you can look at trying to roll a bit more speed around the outside. So again, GT car, stay on the apex, you can try and run an outside line. But that doesn't always work. It depends on how close you are and also how much momentum you're able to carry into this corner. It also depends on the temperature of your tires. But otherwise, the safest option is you stay behind the GT3 driver for now, but you try and stay in the middle of the track here. And then at this point, the GT3 driver will start to run out a little bit wide. So as he's in that transition phase of going from the apex here to going out wide to this exit curve, you can go from running on the outside here to then hitting the apex here and getting a very good exit. And again, multi-class traffic management isn't about how quickly you can overtake the slower class cars. It's about how well you're able to manage your momentum. Basically, you're trying to lose the least amount of time while overtaking slower cars. And oftentimes that means you have to keep your momentum high. So if you end up having to overslow a lot on the exit of a corner because you've dived up the inside of a GT3 car, most of the time you're going to lose more time than if you waited for the GT driver to start getting on the exit of the corner and then you maximize your own exit out of the corner. Typically you gain more doing that rather than diving on the inside of the corner and holding yourself up on the exit. Same thing applies for this turn here, but this turn 9, is what I like to call a short corner. So basically, it's a very similar corner. You've got your turn-in point, which is out here. You've got your apex, which is there. And you've got your exit curb where you run out to. So basically you're going outside, inside, outside in a very short span of time. Now, again, the GT cars are trying to run a very tight line through this corner because they are trying to prevent themselves from washing out too wide so they can put themselves over to the right side for this next turn coming up. Now, you as a hypercar, you can afford to roll more speed through this corner. So if you're right behind a GT3 car coming into this section, so let's say at this point, you're right behind a GT3 car. Lift off the throttle, brake a little bit, slow down the car at this stage. Then you can go almost full throttle through this turn. And because of the gap you had created between yourself and the GT3 car before this point, you can utilize that space to roll more speed through the corner. Take the tight left line here, tight inside line for turn 10, and then you can overtake the GT3 car. So let's just say where my hypercar is right now is where the GT car will be, and this red rectangle is where your hypercar will be if you roll that speed through to take this wider line on exit. Now it does compromise your run into turn 10, but because of your hypercar's better speed, you should be able to clear the GT3 cars before you have to worry about braking for turn 10. One other thing I want to note with hypercars, especially when the tires start to get worn, make sure you don't brake too hard for turn 10. It's very easy to brake too hard and lock up the tires. It's not a heavy braking zone. You can brake 30% brake pressure, you just have to hold it slightly longer, but the car will slow down quickly enough. Now turn 10 is another one where GT3 cars will be going from the outside to the inside, back to the outside. So again, same rule as before applies. If you have a hypercar, wait behind the GT3 car, set up a tight exit, and that way you can get past the GT3 cars without impeding either yourself or the GT3 car too much. And if you're very close to the GT3 car on the entry to the corner, again, that's where you can run a wider line to the middle of the corner, set up a later apex, and voila, you have overtaken a slower class car without losing too much time. Again, prioritize the exits, not the entries, when dealing with slower car traffic. Now, out of this corner, there can sometimes be a bit of miscommunication between GT3 drivers and hypercars. GT3 cars are going from the outside here to the inside. So initially, on the initial exit, hypercars will be overtaken on the left. But then we do get to this transition phase where GT3 cars in the middle of the road. And if they're in the middle of the road, it is better for you as a hypercar to go to the outside, since that is the door that's continuously opening up. If you go for the inside, there is a chance the door will still be closed on you, and there could be some unnecessary contact. Now we get into the triple right-handers. Very crucial set of corners. Here you are tapping the brakes in the hypercars, as well as the GT3 cars, just after this motor brake marker board. Then you're turning in a roughly the same area as in the hypercars as you are in the GT3 cars, but in the hypercars, you do sometimes want to turn a little bit earlier, but it depends. Now, this is a very tricky set of corners because both GT3 cars and hypercars are at the absolute limit of grip here. They're going as fast as they can through these corners. Neither class can easily change their line. So, whereas in previous corners, as a hypercar, you can easily change your line through the corner without losing too much time. The same can't be said for these corners. Now, these corners are surprisingly narrow due to how high speed they are, and also because they have gravel traps on the exit of every corner. You can't afford to run too wide. GT3 cars are going much slower through these corners than hypercars. So if you are finding yourself stuck behind a GT3 car, prepare to overslow a lot more than you're expecting to, because the speed difference is huge. Now let's say you enter the first of these triple right-handers behind a GT3 car. So let's say at this point here, as you pass into the Myrtle Bridge, we are rapidly gaining on a GT3 car, let's just say is over here. Do we dive up the inside for this next corner, or do we wait behind? In this case, you probably could get away with diving up the inside. But at this point, the GT3 driver will be turning in for this apex. So if you do go up the inside, you're going to have to make sure that you are able to, first of all, go up here on the inside, then be fast enough on the entry that you clear the GT3 driver before your lines merge. That's not always very easy. So typically, if at this point, you are only going to be side by side with the GT3 car at his turning point, which is the motor board, don't try to overtake him immediately. Stay behind him for that corner. As we roll through, you want to hold the brakes for longer, and if necessary, you can also run along this outside white line for longer before turning in, bleeding off a bit more speed, then turning in a little bit later, take a later apex. And if you take a later apex and you also do it at a lower speed, you can have a much tighter exit, which is important because the GT3 cars, again, will be going from the outside to the inside, hitting the apex, getting on the throttle, and from that point on, they can't stop themselves from going to the outside curb. They can't. Unless they don't get on the throttle at all until the end of this inside curving. So as a hypercar driver, don't expect for any room to be given to you on the exit of these corners if you're trying to overtake a GT3 driver around the outside. So because of that, in order to minimize that risk, as a hypercar driver, you always want to prioritize putting yourself on the inside of the exit here. Again, you're a hypercar, you've got a lot of downforce, you've got a lot of power, a lot more power than a GT3 driver. So even if it feels like you are now just being blocked on the apex and there's no way you're going to overtake him, don't fret, stay patient. When you get on the throttle at the apex, you will be able to outdrag the GT3 car before you get to this next turn. Now, it is important that you don't drive slower than a GT3 car when you are behind him through this apex, because if you do slow down a lot more than him, then it's not a guarantee you'll be passed before this next corner. So it does require a certain level of commitment and aggression from the hypercar driver to be able to effortlessly and efficiently navigate traffic through this section. Same thing applies for this next corner. You want to prioritize the exit, so if you've got a GT3 car in front, go straighter for a little bit longer. then turn and take a later apex, go on the power at the apex, take a tighter line on the exit. Same thing applies for this corner, but this corner, this third part of the triple right-hander is a little bit different. There's more braking involved. So if you do find yourself along this section taking a tighter line in, and you find yourself here, whilst a GT3 car is here, there is a potential, because you've got more downforce, that you're able to just outbrake them. So this is the one corner which I would consider that you can overtake a GT3 car on the inside under braking, but only if you're already alongside before you even hit the brakes. If not, then just back out of it. And again, communication is important here. If you don't plan on overtaking a GT3 driver through the apex of one of these corners or on the inside under braking, stay behind him on the racing line. If you stay behind him on the racing line, that's telling the GT3 driver in front that, hey, I'm not going to tack into this corner. You do your own thing. I'll sort myself out. Again, communication is key here. You want to be predictable with your movements as a hypercar driver, but also for the GT3 drivers, you want to be predictable with when you're going to use the racing line and when you're not going to use the racing line. You can't just suddenly decide, oh, I'm going to go deep in this corner to try and give space to the hypercar behind. Don't do that. It's very distracting. Other thing as well, don't think suddenly I must take a tight exit because the hypercar is running more speed through the corner. Don't do that because, again, that's being unpredictable. The expected course for the GT3 driver to take is to follow the racing line, go on the throttle on the apex, and run his car out wide using all of the track. Same thing for this next turn, turn 15. This one's got a little bit more braking involved, so again, as a hypercar, you could theoretically outbrake a GT3 driver into this turn, but you have to be already fully alongside before the braking zone. If you're not, there's a high chance you're going to lock up your front tires and just understeer into the GT3 driver at the apex. And again, GT3 drivers will be turning at a very specific point for this corner. If they turn in later than that, there's a high chance they're just going to understeer off the track. So again, you can't expect GT3 drivers to give you a lot of space at the apex of these corners. But if you are behind a GT3 driver, same rules apply. Go a little bit straighter, set up a later apex, get on the power maybe a little bit later on the apex, set up a nice tight exit so that you can overtake the GT3 driver. Again, you don't want to really try and overtake around the outside because that door's going to close, and also there's a gravel trap here. So if you get pushed slightly too wide, you're going to be dipping 2 tires in the gravel trap. Some of these gravel traps have nasty bumps at the end of them, so if you go over that, you might find yourself suddenly being speared sideways into the barrier. Finally, the final corner, turn 16. This one is a constant radius turn, so you also, again, for this one, you can outbrake a GT3 driver into this turn. You can also run a different line where instead of taking the normal line of braking from the outside apex going to the inside here and hugging it, you can brake later on the inside. Point your nose at the apex, go wide, catch the car, bring it back for a double apex. So that's something you can do. So you can either brake early, do a lot of the coasting mid-corner, carry a lot of speed through, or you can brake later, carry less speed mid-corner, but at that stage, you're already well clear of a GT3 car that you're trying to outbrake. If you catch a GT3 car right on the apex of this corner, then same rules from before apply, go wider on the initial part of the turn, and set up a later apex. Again through here, going to be in the apex at this point, so you can get a nice tight exit. Whilst, again, the GT3 car is getting the power, drifting out wide. Also something else, another note is keep an eye on the body language of the GT3 car in front. It is very likely that sooner or later, some of them are going to have snaps of oversteer or drifts in the middle of a corner. When they do that, they will slow down a lot more and take a wider line. So be prepared to slow down even more than you're expecting when you're behind a GT3 car. So always be on the lookout for those types of mistakes because they will happen sooner or later. That's it for me for now. I just wanted to put this out there as a quick heads up of some of the things we can expect from the multi-class traffic management perspective of the special event this weekend.